All right, YouTube, as Obama attempts to ramp up gun control via executive action, something he can't legally really actually do, his fans claim he can. They don't appear to understand the Supreme Court decisions revolving around gun control over time, McDonald versus Chicago, DC versus Heller, or whatever. They just don't understand. They lack all understanding on the topic. They look at what happened in California at San Bernardino. Oh, more gun control needed, and yet California, of course, already has quite a few gun control measures that go well beyond what you find in most states. The guns there were purchased legally within California. The concept of the assault rifle is a misnomer. Um, they always talk about expanded clips, expanded clips. What are these magical clips you're talking about? I think you'll find there's a different, more appropriate term for what you're actually referring to, magazine. But yes, be that as it may. So as Obama continues to push forward with the necessity of an additional gun control, which will do nothing, the things that he's talking about won't stop a single attack. They won't stop a single crime. He's talking about especially expanding, and this is the central point of the video, the ban on buying you'll fail the background check if you try to buy a firearm if you happen to be on the federal do not fly list. This is a list of people that are considered too dangerous to board an aircraft because the worry is they'll probably try to hijack it or bomb the aircraft or something like that. Now, let me try to understand. Now, this goes back before Obama, admittedly. This goes back to pre-Bush era. This is a long-standing policy by the federal government. Let me get this straight. The person is too dangerous to board an aircraft because they might try to hijack it and fly it into a building. And yet the person is roaming around on the streets freely and until now hasn't even been banned from buying a firearm. They can go buy a katana or a broadsword or body armor or anything else they happen to want. They can make their own IEDs, let's face it. They're under surveillance and they're on a do not fly list, and yet they're walking around freely. How does this make sense? You see, what I think is this. The no-fly list is clearly unconstitutional. It does not conform to the right to a speedy, fair public trial. It could be construed as violating equal protection under the law. It could be construed as violating the 10th Amendment, specifically. It could also be construed as violating the right of the people not to have cruel and unusual punishment levied against them, because one could argue if you've been charged with no crime, no warrant has been issued, no actual, you haven't gone to trial at all, and yet you're being prevented from free movement via aircraft, one could argue that's a cruel and unusual punishment, specifically an unusual one. It doesn't really make sense. If a person is so dangerous that they can't be trusted to board an aircraft, here's my suggestion. The government should seek a warrant. It's got rubber stamping FISA courts that'll issue any warrant, however unconstitutional it may be. And it'll rubber stamp it. It'll issue whatever they want. 99% of the time, whatever the federal government or any bureau there is seeking, they'll get from the FISA courts. The threshold for guilt or suspicion of guilt in a FISA court is so much lower than that of an actual honest-to-goodness constitutional court of law that it's little more than a rubber stamping extra-governmental agency masquerading as a court on behalf of Uncle Sam. Let them get their rubber-stamped warrant, conduct an actual investigation, and if they think that the person is dangerous, their garage is stacked with propane tanks and their entire internet search history, all it is looking up bomb-making recipes. If that's the case, let them get the warrant, let them conduct the investigation, and once they have found proper evidence, let them bring these people to trial on charges of plotting terrorism or plotting some other crime, bank heist. Sometimes these people might be, gearing up for war because they intend to, crack open a bank or something like that. I doubt that all of them are jihadists. We've had cases, well-known cases, where somebody tries to board an aircraft only to find that their 90-year-old wheelchair-bound little old granny is on the no-fly list. Or somebody with no criminal record, they've never done anything whatsoever wrong, they're on the no-fly list. Toddlers, infants have been put on the no-fly list. Or somebody is prevented from flight simply because their name happens to be the same as somebody on the no-fly list. Clearly, the application of the law, it's not even really a law, it's a completely arbitrary measurement in this case, breaches the Constitution on multiple levels. It's no different, by the way, than we look back in the McCarthy era, and we find the government and various agencies therein compiling lists of suspected communists, most of which had nothing to do with they weren't espionage agents. They weren't even like socialists. We would call them conservatives nowadays. They just happened to have a couple of points on which they dissented with the standing government at the time, or they happened to get into a verbal squabble with McCarthy or somebody McCarthy liked, and all of a sudden they found themselves undergoing nonstop surveillance. It's a waste of money. It never led to any actual charges against anybody. It was a waste of time, and it violated the Constitution. Now, when we look back at that era, we understand that that's the fact. We understand that it violated the Constitution. But now you have this new updated 2.0 McCarthyism called the no-fly list. It's a completely arbitrary judgment. The government can put you on it for whatever reason it wants and restrict your liberty without trial. That's unconstitutional. Now, I find it very funny that the same people who opposed George W. Bush because of the Patriot Act, because of the arbitrary nature of the no-fly list, because of everything that he did, expanding surveillance powers, militarizing the police, waging war, waging strikes in many nations without a formal declaration of war, without acceding to Congress. The same people that had a big problem with that said, oh, it's tyranny, police state, too authoritarian, we just don't like it. He's trying to go through our library records and stuff. They have no problem anymore with Obama doing it. And if the next president is a Republican, of course, they'll cry bloody murder about the same things Obama's doing that they have no problem with. If it's a Democrat, they'll keep being complacent. And the same is true on the other side. You've got many people who, when W thought these were great ideas, they said, if you oppose this, you're an unpatriotic pinko loony commie or something. Now all of a sudden, you've got a Democrat in office and they say, oh, well, we need to tamp down on some of this government power. It's really rather funny. The no-fly list clearly violates the Constitution in every possible measure and has since it was implemented. The fact that the government, and I think his name is Malloy or something in Connecticut, is trying to tie this into not being able to purchase firearms, clear breach of the Second Amendment of the Constitution. You don't have to support individual gun ownership. The amendment is still there. It's still very much in full force. You can't deprive a U.S. citizen or a lawful resident of their constitutional liberties, those enumerated within the Constitution, without conducting a proper trial. If the government feels that it has a reasonable suspicion that the person is dangerous, they shouldn't be on the streets to begin with. Put them in jail upon a warrant being issued, charges being filed, a proper trial culminating in their arrest and their imprisonment. If you can't get a FISA court, a rubber stamping agency that masquerades as a court, to file a warrant for one of these individuals, then you don't have reasonable suspicion. I'm sorry, but if the FISA court has a problem with your seeking a warrant for searching one of these individuals on the no-fly list, if the FISA court turns you down, you know there's no threat. That person has done nothing wrong. By the way, I find it funny. There are even Republicans that are encouraging the use of the no-fly list and even the application of this in a gun control manner, which is, again, unconstitutional. I find that extremely funny because these people just got done telling us, oh, well, the IRS has breached the Constitution. It's going after conservative groups. This federal agency is out of control, and yet you're trying to give every other federal agency under the sun the right to say, oh, well, this person should be on the no-fly list. They shouldn't be able to have a firearm. They shouldn't be able to fly. And by the way, the appeals process for this list takes so many fucking years. You're going to have a high-powered lawyer pay through the nose, and then they still might reject you, and there's nothing you can do about it. But the fact is, the no-fly list itself is unconstitutional. Clearly, it is. Funnily enough, I had some person tell me, when I brought up the fact that the no-fly list was unconstitutional, on social media, that is, had a person say, well, airlines can turn anybody down for air travel they want. I literally had to explain to people, the airlines are not the government, and the government is not the airlines. This is an arbitrary list created by a bunch of unaccountable DC bureaucrats. They just essentially put whoever they want on this list, and you're talking about how it's acceptable to deprive them of one of their constitutional rights. Okay, what if they create a list of malcontents that might be suspicious? And they start saying, well, they're First Amendment rights, they don't need those either. The right to privacy, they don't need that. And just create a whole slave class of hundreds of thousands of people that they're not allowed to organize. They don't have freedom of religion or whatever. No, these people would be uncomfortable with that. They'd say, well, it violates the Constitution, violates their freedom. You know, the government can't just come in and violate their First Amendment rights on a whim. That's the fucking point I'm trying to make, and you people are too dense to understand that. You don't have to believe in individual firearm ownership. You don't have to have a strong feeling about it, or you can oppose the concept of people owning firearms. But the right is still there. There are people who would say, well, we shouldn't have freedom of religion. Everyone should be a fucking Christian if they're going to live here and be a citizen. But the right is still there, quite clearly. The government doesn't have the right to simply come in and strip you of that liberty based solely on suspicion, because if there is a reasonable suspicion, they should proceed to trial. They should have a warrant issued. They should conform to the Constitution, which protects you against being punished for crimes you might commit. Maybe you'll become a criminal, so you don't have any rights. It's not the way that the system is supposed to work. The Supreme Court has been fairly straightforward on these things. You can't throw somebody in jail on the suspicion that they might commit a crime in the future. And by the way, these same people, whenever a police department profiles someone, throws them in jail for a few months without letting them really appeal the fact that they're in jail, and you know, like the Chicago black site that they've been operating that got people up in arms, that's one of the reasons Emmanuel is facing possible removal, which he should be removed. The Chicago police have gone way too fucking far at this point. You don't have to be black to understand that. One look at their secretive black operations site and the fact that they just pull people in off the streets and hold them there for indefinite periods, that violates the Constitution. What part of that don't you understand? It doesn't matter if they're black or white, it still violates the Constitution. They're U.S. citizens. But when the police profile somebody usually for a racial motive, let's face it, or, you know, you're in the wrong, fuck it, you don't look like you belong in this neighborhood, we're going to haul you in for questioning, and hold somebody there and probably tortures them, deprives them of seeing a lawyer, deprives them of their basic rights and Miranda rights or whatever. Then these same people, they say, well, this breaches the Constitution, you can't, you know, hold someone in jail forever, because all you've got is suspicion. Maybe the suspicion's not even warranted. Maybe there's literally nothing that they've done wrong. Suspicion flies out the window at that point. You shouldn't be suspicious of them because you've got no shred of evidence that any wrongdoing, any criminal act has been performed or planned to be performed. Now, so they should be free. I agree with that. Why don't you apply this then to the federal government, not just your local metropolitan police? I would think that the threshold for the government, which is specifically and explicitly constrained by the U.S. Constitution, would be that the threshold for them violating it would be far lower than for an agency that's working at the city or you know, the county level. They're not really a government agency. Kind of, at this point, we might as well say the police are a government agency, but not in the strictest sense, not completely and necessarily. I would think that the threshold for them would actually be a little bit higher for violating they can violate a person's civil rights quite easily. But can they really be said to suppress somebody's free speech or something? Yes, incidentally, of course, but they're not the ones that pass laws. The police do not get to randomly create laws just because they happen to want to enforce them. They try. Civil asset forfeiture is one of them. That's another unconstitutional act that needs to be done away with. No, there shouldn't even be a no-fly list. If the government believes that somebody is such a credible threat that they can't even get on an aircraft, bring them to trial and let a jury convict them. Otherwise, leave them alone, because if you can't get them to, most of the time someone goes on trial, even if the evidence is kind of lacking, they're still going to go to jail. Our justice system is already corrupt and heavily weighted in favor of finding everybody guilty, unless the person happens to be really rich or well connected. Well, most of the people on the no-fly list presumably aren't. Now, we also find out, by the way, there are a bunch of DHS employees that are suspected terrorists or something. What the hell is going on? This is why I question and oppose any increase in government power, because we've increased it time and time again. We are no safer. We are arguably less safe. The government is too inefficient to administer the sort of programs and steps necessary to protect us from terrorists. It would be much easier to simply have an armed population that is ready and willing to defend their country, and to let local enforcement take control, because time and time again, we've had credible terrorist threats in this country stopped by local law enforcement. We're talking small town sheriff's offices or some fringe metro police force, in the outlands of some big city. They'll stop terrorism. We have, again, mall cop security guards stop the shooters in Garland, but we've never seen a single solitary case where any major federal agency with surveillance powers, with the ability to suggest someone goes on the no-fly list, we've seen not one case where any of these agencies have stopped any credible terrorist threat. We had Clapper come before Congress and claim, oh yeah, we've stopped hundreds of possible attacks. But when questioned by pro-police state Leahy, a lackey of Obama at this point, who's on board, he was co-author of SOPA, loves the TPP. I mean, he's far out there in authoritarian field. He's from my state, unfortunately. I certainly am not a supporter of Leahy. Even he comes out at that point, questions Clapper and says, well, you can't really verify most of those claims now, Mr. Clapper, can you? And Clapper, of course, had to admit, no, we can't actually verify those, because there are none. They've stopped no attacks. We've seen San Bernardino, Fort Hood, the Boston Marathon bombings. Many of these individuals are under scrutiny to begin with, and yet they're not stopped. I would think if a person is a threat, they don't need to go on a nice, kind little no-fly list to keep them off planes. What the fuck's that supposed to do? How the hell does that keep us any safer? No, the proper thing to do is get a warrant, bring them to trial, conform with the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't magically disappear and alter its form because people happen to be afraid of terrorism. By the way, the U.S. population largely is responsible for this problem. After 9/11, they were all screaming about how terrified they were and saying, Uncle Sam, save me, Uncle Sam, save me. We need surveillance, and we need a war, and we need more military police. We need this and that and the other thing. You're the ones that ushered in, largely, by your own palpable glee at supporting such a thing, the authoritarianism that now is a far greater challenge to this nation than terrorists are. Most of the time when terrorists do anything, they're bombing things over in the Middle East, not bombing things here. Most of the time they're killing other Muslims over in the deserts. I don't care if they do that. Yeah, it's regrettable. Lots of women and children and old people, pensioners and stuff, they get killed. Folks, you should have realized after 9/11 that the people responsible for 9/11 are people that are allied with the U.S. government. Most of them were Saudis. We give the Saudi Arabians tens of billions of dollars in free goodies every year. They say, oh, well, we give them like $1 billion a year. Yeah, in money. What about all the weapons we give them? They're valued in the tens of billions. The same's true with Israel and Egypt, by the way. The sort of gruesome threesome of nations we really shouldn't be supporting. They're all totalitarian, dysfunctional states. Egypt is sort of the less authoritarian of the three. They've restabilized to some degree. We give them all sorts of weapons, and look at where all the hijackers came from. Look at where they trained. Oh, Saudi Arabia. Osama, the Saudi Arabian, member of the same sort of royal lineage as the people who hold control there. And yet we ended up going to war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Well, what a coincidence. We didn't go to war with Saudi Arabia. Now I wonder why that is, children. See, Uncle Sam caused the problem. Our huge level of support for a regime that clearly doesn't actually care about us just wants to sell us oil and make even more money. That is the Saudi Arabians and their allies within the region. Our support for them, plus our support for groups like the Mujahideen, which were also allied with good old friend Osama. He used to be good old friend of the U.S. when he was fighting the Soviets. That's what caused the problem. The government caused the same problem that it then wanted more power to fix thereafter. And our invasion of Iraq has caused the new level of problems, which is ISIS, by which they want even more power to fix the problem. Now, don't you notice a little bit of a pattern here? Well, we go in. Well, actually, first we go in, support the Iranians. The Iranians go apeshit. We end up abandoning them. Then we support Saddam. We actually let him gas the Iranians. And all of a sudden, the Iranians fund all these Shiite militias because they're worried about the fact that the Sunnis want to tear their country apart and destroy them. So that makes the region a little bit less safe. Then the Soviets get involved in the general Middle East and over into South Asia. So, Carter and then Reagan says, oh, well, we'll just arm the Mujahideen. And it did a great job. They beat the shit out of the Soviets. So many Soviets died. I mean, that was like the beginning of the end for the USSR. They couldn't even hold out against a bunch of militants in Afghanistan. Sort of like Iraq 1.0 when you think about it. The same problems we had in Iraq, the Soviets had in Afghanistan. Only worse. They've still got literal statues made out of like busted out tanks and planes from when the Soviets tried and failed to engage them there. To cut their way, they wanted sort of access to Iran in a more physical sense. They wouldn't have to go around sort of the other side, around like Armenia and places like that. They wanted to go right down through Central Asia and build infrastructure there to save their dying economy. So we armed the Mujahideen, and everything was hunky-dory until Osama said, well, fuck the Western Satan. And then things got bad. So then somehow, even though the Saudi Arabians were responsible for 9/11 largely, and the declassified 9/11 report will vindicate my statement there when it's eventually released in unredacted form, we somehow got involved in Iraq and Afghanistan. Osama was in Pakistan at the time, but we were too busy in Afghanistan for some reason, nation building there. We got into Iraq. Now ISIS springs up, and the government wants still more power. The fact is that most of the powers it has tried to absorb are unconstitutional. Most of the acts which it has tried to undergo to restabilize these areas in the Middle East don't work. They make things worse. So why would I want to give the government more power in a domestic and a foreign sense when clearly every application of power it has ever used has backfired? That's not sensible foreign policy. It just doesn't make sense. It sounds a lot like, again, that same McCarthy era. We got involved in all of these states where people were too far left, or maybe they'll become too far left, or one of our allies is endangered by a far left regime. Except when we were supporting far left, the U.S. recognized Pol Pot as the legitimate government of Cambodia. But, oh yeah, that was a good one. Only 3 million people got killed. Yeah, except where we, oddly enough, supported communistic regimes. It's really, really strange. You see, DC doesn't really know what it's doing. It reacts to these situations in the same predictable, stupid manner, and people are too dumb to even realize what's happening. We've tried this before. We've been trying this since the 1950s. It has never worked. The best thing that we can do is conform to the Constitution at home, defend our allies, and leave the rest of these states alone. I do not care if Iraq and Syria implode. I don't care if the Korean Peninsula falls into infighting. We will defend our allies if that happens. Until then, we don't need to provoke anybody. We don't need to operate in any of these nations. We've clearly delineated who our allies are, who we intend to defend, and enemies of those states beware. But, on 9/11, we weren't attacked by Saddam Hussein. We weren't attacked by the nation of Afghanistan. We were attacked by a Saudi royal and a bunch of Saudi hijackers, one of which had already gone to Pakistan by that time, the rest of which were trained right there in Saudi Arabia. And somehow, nobody wanted to talk about the Saudi Arabians after 9/11. They were too busy fixating on catching this elusive Osama, who may have already died by 2003, 2004, assuming that Pakistan's prime minister at the time was right. And I would think since he was in Pakistan at the time, she probably knew. Yeah, Osama just kicked the bucket because he has severe renal failure. So there you go. Now, no-fly list is unconstitutional. Its application, as far as guns go, is retarded because, again, if the no-fly list itself breaches the Constitution, adding a new layer to it, it's just, it's nonsense. The government doesn't actually have the power to do this. The 10th Amendment is quite clear about limiting federal power. The federal government has begun to act as an authority unto itself, which is capable of violating any law, act, or constitutional content at a whim. That's not the way that it works. Unfortunately, the way our system does work, when the federal government does violate the Constitution, it takes a long time, generally speaking, for it to actually be determined to be a violation and then done away with because the court system is so slow. Except, of course, if it happens to be a court created by the federal government to rubber stamp blanket surveillance warrants. In that case, it works really fast. You can get results next day, usually, because they'll simply put a yes on whatever you happen to have filed, because they're a bunch of federal agents to begin with. Oh yeah, and some federal agents can sign their own warrants somehow. I'm not sure how that conforms to the Constitution. See, we spend so much money on all these stupid programs. They're not keeping us safer. It's just McCarthyism 2.0. I'm not inordinately worried about Islamic terrorists because largely they're getting beaten on by one another on a regular basis. Hate to say it, I don't think they're quite as powerful and well organized as many people believe. But what is powerful and well organized is DC, and DC, again, acts as a law unto itself, violating the Constitution at a whim. We need to more powerfully restrain government. I personally believe it's time now where we should expand the Constitution. We should call up a convention, add a few amendments, more strictly constraining state and federal power in order to preserve our liberty and prevent the sort of shit that we're currently going through. Because clearly their foreign policy is not working. We've spent so much money over the last half century. Where's it gotten us? Are we any safer? People are still worried about doomsday coming or, terrorists using nerve gas or something. Are we any safer than we were, when the atomic arms race began? No, we're less safe now, partially because of what DC has done. That's about all.